Move along, sport. Priority boarding is for people who actually belong in first class.
Captain William Hayes's voice carried that practiced airline authority, but his eyes held pure disdain as he looked at James Rivera. The black man in worn jeans and a faded University of Miami hoodie didn't fit Hayes's mental image of a premium passenger. What Hayes didn't know was that in exactly 14 minutes, the man he just dismissed would ground his plane and end his career at 38,000 feet. Before we dive into this story that changed aviation forever, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And if this moment of justice stops you in your tracks the way it did every witness that day, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Stories like this need to be heard. The air inside Orlando International Airport's Terminal B was thick with the humidity of a Florida evening and the tension of delayed flights. Gate B-24 buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Thursday night departure rush. Flight 447 to Chicago O'Hare was running 20 minutes behind schedule, and Captain Hayes was taking it personally. James Rivera stood quietly near the priority boarding line, boarding pass in hand, watching the controlled madness unfold around him. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to navigate a world that often questioned his right to occupy space. His dark skin contrasted sharply with the faded fabric of his hoodie, and his sneakers had seen better days. To anyone glancing his way, he looked like a college student heading home, or maybe a construction worker lucky enough to afford a flight. No one would have guessed that James Rivera owned the airline they were about to board. Captain Hayes emerged from the jet bridge, his crisp navy uniform adorned with 4 gold stripes that caught the terminal's fluorescent lighting. At 48, he had the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from 2 decades in cockpits and 3 failed marriages. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his posture military straight, and his expression carried the perpetual authority of someone who had spent years being called captain by everyone he met. Behind him walked First Officer Ryan Blake, a lanky 31-year-old with nervous energy and the eager-to-please demeanor of someone still climbing the aviation ladder. Ryan carried their flight bags and checked his tablet obsessively, running through pre-flight protocols with the dedication of someone who still believed rules mattered more than politics. Hayes surveyed the gate area like a general inspecting his troops. His gaze swept over the crowd of passengers, categorizing them with practiced efficiency. Business travelers in expensive suits earned a nod of approval. Families with well-dressed children received a professional smile. But when his eyes landed on James Rivera, standing calmly in the priority line, his expression shifted to something colder. Ryan Hayes muttered to his first officer loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Looks like gate control isn't screening the priority line properly tonight." Sophia Martinez, the 26-year-old gate agent, looked up from her computer screen. She had been working for Skybound Airlines for 3 years, long enough to recognize the tone in Hayes's voice. Sophia was the daughter of immigrants, the first in her family to attend college, and she took pride in treating every passenger with the same respect she hoped to receive. But she also knew that Captain Hayes had the power to make her life difficult with a single complaint to management. Hayes approached the priority boarding line with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to crowds parting before him. He stopped directly in front of James Rivera, close enough that the height difference between them became obvious to everyone watching. "Excuse me, Hayes," said his voice carrying that practiced pilot authority. "I think you might be in the wrong line." James looked up from his phone, meeting Hayes's gaze with calm brown eyes that held no trace of intimidation. "I don't think so, Captain. Priority boarding for first class." Hayes glanced at the boarding pass in James's hand without really looking at it. "Let me guess. Someone gave you an upgrade you didn't earn." A few passengers turned to watch the exchange. Among them was Jennifer Walsh, a 34-year-old marketing executive from Tampa who had already started recording on her phone. She had witnessed enough workplace discrimination to recognize it when she saw it, and something about the captain's tone set off her internal alarms. "I earned my seat," James replied, his voice steady and controlled. Question is whether you've earned yours. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Hayes's face flushed slightly, a vein becoming visible along his temple. In his world, passengers didn't question captains, especially passengers who looked like the man standing in front of him. Security Hayes called out, his voice echoing across the gate area. "We have an aggressive passenger situation here." Sophia Martinez felt her stomach drop. She could see James Rivera's boarding pass from her position at the gate podium, and it was legitimate. More than legitimate. It was a first-class ticket with elite status markers that indicated this man was exactly the kind of customer skybound airlines valued most. But Hayes was already committed to his course of action, and backing down would mean admitting he had made an assumption based on appearance rather than fact. "Captain Hayes." Sophia called out, her voice carefully respectful but tinged with urgency. "Sir, I can verify the passenger's documentation if needed." Hayes turned to her with the kind of look that had ended careers. "Ms. Martinez, when I need input from ground crew, I'll ask for it. Right now, I need you to handle the security situation I've identified." Two airport security officers approached the gate, their expressions neutral but alert. James Rivera hadn't moved from his position in line, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made any gesture that could be interpreted as aggressive. He simply stood there, boarding pass in hand, watching a 48-year-old man destroy his own career with each passing second. "What seems to be the problem?" asked Officer Tom Rodriguez, a 15-year airport security veteran who had seen every kind of passenger dispute imaginable. Hayes pointed at James with the same gesture he might use to identify a piece of suspicious luggage. "This individual is attempting to board using priority boarding without proper documentation. When I questioned him about it, he became aggressive and threatening." Officer Rodriguez looked at James, taking in his calm posture and relaxed expression. "Sir, can I see your boarding pass?" James handed over the document without comment. Rodriguez examined it carefully, noting the first-class designation, the elite status indicators, and the fact that everything appeared to be in perfect order. Captain Rodriguez said carefully, "This appears to be a valid first-class boarding pass, with all appropriate priority markers." Hayes snatched the boarding pass from the security officer's hand, squinting at it as if he could will it to reveal fraud. The document was clean, professional, and undeniably legitimate. But Hayes had painted himself into a corner, and his ego wouldn't allow him to admit error in front of a growing crowd of witnesses. "Anyone can print a fake boarding pass these days," Hayes declared, his voice rising. "I've been flying for 18 years, and I know suspicious behavior when I see it." Jennifer Walsh had now been joined by 3 other passengers recording the encounter. Marcus Thompson, a 29-year-old software engineer, was live-streaming the incident to his 15,000 followers on social media. The hashtag Flight447 was already beginning to trend, though no one at the gate knew it yet. James Rivera remained perfectly still, but something in his eyes shifted. Not anger. That would come too easily and accomplish too little. Instead, there was a calculating quality like a chess master who had just seen the endgame 20 moves ahead. Captain Hayes James said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for the security officers and nearby passengers to hear. "This conversation will define your legacy." Hayes laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that masked uncertainty rather than expressing amusement. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm stating a fact," James replied. "Every choice has consequences. You're about to learn what yours look like." The crowd around the gate had grown larger, drawn by the commotion and the increasingly obvious injustice playing out before them. Sophia Martinez watched from behind the podium, her hands shaking slightly as she realized she was witnessing something that would probably make the news. She wanted to speak up to show the captain James Rivera's passenger profile on her computer screen to stop this disaster before it went any further. But Hayes had already made it clear that her input wasn't welcome. Ryan Blake, the first officer, stood off to the side with growing discomfort. He had worked with Hayes for 6 months and had seen glimpses of this attitude before, but never so publicly displayed. Ryan knew that whatever was happening here would reflect on him as well, and his own career could be collateral damage in Hayes' personal war against a passenger who had committed no crime other than existing in a space Hayes didn't think he belonged. Officer Rodriguez Hayes said, turning back to the security team, "I want this individual removed from the priority boarding area immediately. He's disrupting the orderly boarding process and making other passengers uncomfortable." Rodriguez looked around at the other passengers, noting their expressions. No one looked uncomfortable because of James Rivera. They looked uncomfortable because of what they were witnessing from their captain. Sir Rodriguez said to Hayes the passenger has valid documentation and hasn't displayed any threatening behavior. I don't have grounds to remove him from the boarding area. Hayes's face had progressed from flushed to nearly purple. The gold stripes on his uniform caught the light as his chest rose and fell with barely controlled anger. Fine, he can board. But I want it noted that this individual was flagged for suspicious behavior, and I'll be filing a report with corporate security. James Rivera nodded once as if Hayes had just confirmed something he had been wondering about. I'm sure corporate will find that report very interesting, Captain. There was something in the way he said captain that made Hayes's blood pressure spike even higher. It wasn't mocking or disrespectful in any way that could be reported or disciplined. It was simply the tone of someone who understood exactly what kind of man he was dealing with and found him wanting. The boarding process began in earnest, with Hayes making a show of checking every passenger's documentation personally before allowing them down the jet bridge. When James Rivera's turn came, Hayes examined the boarding pass with exaggerated scrutiny, holding it up to the light as if looking for watermarks. First class seat 2A. Hayes announced loudly enough for other passengers to hear. I hope you enjoy the flight, Mr. He paused, squinting at the name on the boarding pass as if seeing it for the first time. Rivera. James Rivera walked down the jet bridge with the same measured pace he had maintained throughout the confrontation. Behind him, he could hear Hayes continuing to make comments to other passengers, each one designed to cast doubt on his right to be in first class. But James had learned long ago that dignity was a choice, not a circumstance, and he chose it every day, regardless of how others behaved. What Captain Hayes couldn't have known was the journey that had brought James to this moment. At 42, James Rivera was worth approximately $3.2 billion, making him one of the youngest African-American billionaires in the United States. His empire had started with a single computer in his college dorm room at the University of Miami, where he had written code for a logistics optimization program that would eventually revolutionize supply chain management for major corporations. But before the billions, before the empire, before the power to change industries with a phone call, James had been just another black kid from Liberty City, Miami's roughest neighborhood. His mother, Carmen Rivera, had worked 3 jobs to keep their small apartment in a building where gunshots were as common as car horns. His father had never been in the picture, leaving Carmen to raise James and his younger sister, Maria, alone. The first time James had flown on an airplane, he was 19 years old and heading to a technology conference in California on a scholarship. He had saved for months to buy a basic economy ticket, and he remembered the excitement of walking down the jet bridge, dreaming about the opportunities that awaited him in Silicon Valley. But that excitement had turned to humiliation when a flight attendant stopped him at the entrance to the aircraft. "Excuse me," she had said, her smile polite but her eyes cold. "Can I see your boarding pass? I think you might be looking for a different gate." James had been wearing his best clothes, a suit he had bought at a thrift store and shoes he had polished until they gleamed. But his skin color had been enough to make the flight attendant assume he didn't belong on the plane. The memory of that moment of standing in the aisle while other passengers stared and whispered had burned itself into his consciousness. It became fuel for everything that came after. The logistics program he developed in college caught the attention of a venture capital firm in 2003. By 2005, he had sold his first company for $50 million. By 2010, his second company had gone public with a valuation of over $800 million. By 2015, he had begun acquiring companies across multiple industries, always with the same focus, creating value while ensuring that the people who worked for him were treated with dignity and respect. The airline industry had entered James's portfolio almost by accident. In 2018, he had been approached by a struggling regional carrier that needed emergency funding to avoid bankruptcy. AeroVenture Holdings. His investment firm had provided the capital in exchange for a controlling stake. Within 2 years, James had transformed the carrier from a regional operator into a mid-sized national airline. He had done it by focusing on employee satisfaction, customer service, and operational excellence. When rumors of discrimination began reaching his office 6 months ago, James had initially tried to address them through traditional channels. Anonymous complaint networks, diversity training programs, policy reviews, all the standard corporate responses. But the complaints kept coming, always involving the same patterns: Black and Hispanic passengers questioned about their right to premium seating, subjected to additional security screening, or simply treated with less courtesy than their white counterparts. The final straw had come 3 weeks ago when a video went viral showing a Black family being removed from one of his airline's flights after a complaint about their suspicious behavior. The family had been traveling to a funeral, and their only suspicious behavior had been traveling while Black. James had issued a public apology, settled with the family, and fired the crew involved. But he knew that individual firings wouldn't solve an institutional problem. That was why James Rivera, billionaire airline owner, was sitting in seat 2A wearing a hoodie and jeans instead of a business suit. He needed to see the problem firsthand to experience what his customers experienced when they didn't have the protection of wealth and status. What he hadn't expected was to encounter discrimination before he even boarded the aircraft. Captain William Hayes, meanwhile, had his own history that had led to this moment. Born in 1975 in suburban Atlanta, Hayes had grown up in a middle-class family that had instilled in him a sense of natural superiority. His father had been an Air Force colonel, his mother a bank executive, and Hayes had been raised to believe that authority and respect were his birthright. Hayes had joined the Air Force after college, flying transport planes in Iraq and Afghanistan. He had been a competent pilot, but an indifferent leader more concerned with his own advancement than the welfare of his crew. When he left the military in 2006, he had joined Skybound Airlines as a first officer with dreams of quickly advancing to captain. The promotion to captain had come in 2009, during a period when the airline was expanding rapidly and needed experienced pilots. Hayes had passed all the required tests and training programs, but no amount of training could address the fundamental character flaws that would define his career. He saw the cockpit as his personal kingdom, the cabin crew as his subjects, and passengers as necessary inconveniences to be tolerated rather than customers to be served. Over the years, Hayes had accumulated a file of complaints that would have ended most careers. Flight attendants reported his inappropriate comments and aggressive behavior. Passengers complained about his rude announcements and unprofessional conduct. Gate agents documented his interference with their operations. But Hayes had two things protecting him: a powerful union contract and a director of operations who shared his views about maintaining traditional standards in the airline industry. Greg Morrison, Skybound's director of flight operations, had grown up in the same era as Hayes and shared his belief that commercial aviation was becoming too politically correct. Morrison had quietly buried complaints, transferred accusers to different bases, and protected Hayes through 3 separate HR investigations. Their arrangement was simple. Hayes delivered reliable flight operations without generating publicity, and Morrison provided cover for his excesses. The arrangement had worked perfectly for over a decade. Until tonight, when Hayes had chosen to target a passenger who owned the whole arrangement itself. Ryan Blake, the first officer sitting in the cockpit next to Hayes, represented a different generation of aviators. At 31, Ryan had grown up in an era of diversity training and cultural awareness. He had joined Skybound Airlines directly from a college aviation program with none of the military background that often shaped older pilots' attitudes. Ryan believed in professionalism, teamwork, and treating every passenger with respect regardless of their appearance or background. But Ryan was also junior dependent on Hayes for training and career advancement, and acutely aware that speaking up against a senior captain could end his own aspirations. He had witnessed Hayes's behavior before and had always found reasons to stay silent. Tonight, however, watching the confrontation at the gate, Ryan felt a knot forming in his stomach that had nothing to do with pre-flight nerves. Sophia Martinez, still manning the gate podium, couldn't shake the image of James Rivera's calm dignity in the face of Hayes's hostility. As the daughter of Mexican immigrants, Sophia had experienced her own share of discrimination and prejudice. She had worked her way through college while supporting her younger brothers, taking airline industry courses at night while working customer service jobs during the day. The gate agent position at Skybound represented the fulfillment of a dream to work in aviation, but moments like tonight made her question whether the industry she loved was worthy of her dedication. Sophia pulled up James Rivera's passenger profile on her computer screen, curious about the man who had handled Hayes's attacks with such composure. What she saw made her gasp audibly. Elite status markers indicated this passenger flew first class over 100 times per year. His loyalty level was the highest in Skybound's program. Most telling of all, there was a special notation on his account that Sophia had never seen before: corporate VIP, executive-level access. She stared at the screen for a long moment, understanding dawning like sunrise after a dark night. This wasn't just a case of a pilot harassing a passenger. This was a case of an employee attacking his own boss without knowing it. And Sophia was one of the few people in the terminal who understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Meanwhile, the passengers who had witnessed the gate confrontation were sharing their recordings across social media platforms. Jennifer Walsh uploaded her video to Twitter with the caption, "Skybound Airlines captain just racially profiled a first-class passenger at Orlando Airport. This is 2024, people. Do better." The video received 50 shares in the first 10 minutes. Marcus Thompson's live stream had attracted over 2,000 viewers in real time, with comments ranging from outrage to disbelief. The hashtag Flight447 began trending in Florida, then across the Southeast, as people shared the story of a captain who had publicly humiliated a passenger based on nothing more than appearance and assumptions. None of the social media users knew they were documenting the beginning of one of the most significant moments in aviation industry history. They thought they were sharing another example of everyday racism, another data point in America's ongoing struggle with prejudice and bias. They had no idea they were watching the setup for a masterclass in justice delivered at 35,000 feet. As the last passengers boarded Flight 447, the aircraft represented a powder keg of tension, injustice, and impending revelation. In Seat 2A, James Rivera reviewed financial reports on his tablet, preparing for the moment when he would transform from target to judge. In the cockpit, Captain Hayes ran through his pre-flight checklist, unaware that he had just purchased a one-way ticket to unemployment. And throughout the cabin, passengers settled into their seats, phones charged and cameras ready, about to become witnesses to a confrontation that would redefine accountability in the skies. The stage was set. The players were in position. And Flight 447 to Chicago was about to become the most expensive lesson in respect that commercial aviation had ever seen. The Boeing 737-800 stretched before the boarding passengers like a gleaming metal promise of swift transport to Chicago. But as travelers made their way down the narrow aisle, the atmosphere inside the aircraft carried an electric tension that had nothing to do with weather or turbulence. Captain Hayes had preceded the boarding passengers into the cockpit, where he sat with Ryan Blake, ostensibly running through pre-flight procedures but actually nursing his wounded pride and planning his next move. James Rivera had taken his seat in 2A without fanfare, stowing his small carry-on bag and settling in with the practiced ease of someone who flew first class regularly. The leather seat enveloped him comfortably, and he accepted the pre-departure beverage offered by the lead flight attendant with a quiet thank you that carried no trace of the confrontation he had just endured. But Hayes wasn't finished. From the cockpit, he could see through the partially open door to the first-class cabin where James sat quietly reading something on his tablet. The sight of the man who had challenged his authority now enjoying premium service fueled a rage that Hayes could barely contain. Ryan Hayes set his voice tight with suppressed anger. "I want you to make a note in the flight log about the security situation we had during boarding." First Officer Blake looked up from his checklist, confusion written across his young features. "Sir, I didn't see any security situation." Hayes's jaw clenched. "The aggressive passenger in 2A? The one who threatened me during the boarding process?" Ryan had witnessed the entire gate confrontation, and his memory of events didn't match Hayes's characterization at all. "Captain, with respect, I didn't observe any threatening behavior from that passenger. He seemed quite calm, actually." Blake Hayes said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Are you questioning my judgment?" The threat was implicit but clear. Ryan understood that his career advancement depended entirely on Hayes's recommendations and evaluations. A negative report from a senior captain could end his aspirations before they truly began. "No, sir. I'll make the notation." As Ryan reluctantly entered Hayes's fictional account into the digital log, Hayes was already planning his next escalation. He activated the aircraft's public address program, his voice booming through the cabin speakers with the authority that 18 years of flying had given him. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we begin our departure procedures, I want to remind all passengers that federal law requires compliance with all crew member instructions. Any passenger who fails to comply with crew instructions or displays disruptive behavior will be removed from the aircraft and may face federal charges." The announcement was standard in its words, but unusual in its timing and tone. Normally, such warnings were delivered by flight attendants during the safety demonstration, not by the captain before departure. But Hayes wasn't finished. "We have a full flight tonight, and I want to ensure that all passengers feel safe and secure during our journey to Chicago. If any passenger feels uncomfortable or threatened by the behavior of another passenger, please notify a flight attendant immediately." In seat 2A, James Rivera didn't look up from his tablet, but a slight tightening around his eyes was the only indication that he understood exactly why that announcement had been made. Several passengers in the first-class cabin glanced in his direction, recognizing him as the man who had been confronted at the gate and understanding the captain's not-so-subtle message. Jennifer Walsh, seated in 4C, pulled out her phone again. She had continued recording sporadically since the gate incident, and Hayes's announcement struck her as another piece of evidence in what was becoming a clear pattern of targeted harassment. Her video captured not just the captain's words, but the uncomfortable glances and murmured conversations that followed his announcement. The boarding process continued, but Hayes's interference had created a ripple effect throughout the aircraft. Flight attendant Patricia Coleman, a 15-year veteran with Skybound Airlines, approached the cockpit with obvious concern. "Captain Hayes," she said quietly, "some passengers are asking about the announcement you just made. They seem confused about whether there's an actual security threat." Hayes emerged from the cockpit, his presence instantly commanding the attention of everyone in the first-class cabin. He was a large man, and the narrow confines of the aircraft made him seem even more imposing as he surveyed his domain. "There's no immediate threat," Patricia Hayes said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the cabin. "I just want to make sure everyone understands that we maintain certain standards on this aircraft." His gaze settled on James Rivera, who continued to read his tablet with the same calm concentration he had displayed throughout the evening. "Some passengers seem to think that purchasing a ticket entitles them to more than just transportation. They think it gives them the right to challenge crew authority or make other passengers uncomfortable with their behavior." Patricia followed Hayes's gaze and immediately understood the subtext of his comments. She had worked in the industry long enough to recognize discrimination when she saw it, and what she was witnessing made her stomach turn. "Captain, is there a specific incident you're referring to?" Just making sure everyone knows where they stand," Hayes replied, his eyes never leaving James Rivera. Some people need clearer boundaries than others. The first-class cabin had gone completely silent. Every passenger was now acutely aware that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a captain using his position of authority to continue harassing a passenger who had committed no offense other than existing in a space the captain didn't think he belonged. Marcus Thompson, the software engineer who had been live streaming earlier, had managed to get an aisle seat in the main cabin where he had a clear view of the first-class area. His phone was recording again, capturing Hayes' performance for his growing online audience. The live stream chat was exploding with comments, and the viewer count had climbed past 5,000 people watching in real time. Sofia Martinez watched the boarding process from the gate podium, unable to shake her growing sense of dread. She had tried twice to contact her supervisor about the passenger profile information she had discovered, but both calls had gone to voicemail. The special notation on James Rivera's account meant something significant, but Sofia wasn't sure what or how to act on the information. As the last passengers found their seats, Hayes made one final announcement. "Flight attendants, please prepare for departure and conduct your final safety check. Pay special attention to passengers who might not be familiar with aircraft safety procedures." The addition was unnecessary and pointed another clear reference to his assumption that James Rivera didn't belong on the aircraft. But if Hayes expected his target to react with anger or embarrassment, he was disappointed. James Rivera simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone with a distinctive titanium case. Ryan Blake, watching from the cockpit, noticed something unusual about the passenger in 2A. While everyone else on the aircraft seemed agitated or uncomfortable because of Hayes' behavior, this man appeared to be growing calmer and more focused. There was something almost predatory in his stillness, like an apex predator conserving energy before a strike. Hayes returned to the cockpit to begin the departure sequence, but his anger was still evident in every movement. He slammed switches harder than necessary, barked unnecessarily sharp commands at air traffic control, and generally created an atmosphere of tension that Ryan had never experienced in his 6 months of flying with senior captains. Captain Ryan ventured carefully, "Shouldn't we focus on the flight operations? The passengers seem settled and we have a schedule to maintain." Hayes whipped around in his seat to face his first officer. "Blake, let me explain something to you. I've been flying since before you graduated high school. I know how to read people, and I know when someone doesn't belong on my aircraft. That passenger in 2A is trouble, and if we don't establish clear boundaries now, we'll have problems at altitude." Ryan looked through the cockpit door at James Rivera, who was now typing something on his phone with the focused attention of someone composing an important message. "Sir, he seems to be behaving normally. Maybe you should remember who's the captain on this flight," Hayes interrupted. "Your job is to support my decisions, not question them." The exchange was overheard by Patricia Coleman, who was conducting her final pre-flight safety check near the cockpit. She had worked with dozens of captains over her 15-year career, and she had never heard one speak to a first officer with such open hostility over a passenger issue. The entire situation felt wrong in ways that she couldn't articulate, but her position in the crew hierarchy meant that questioning a captain's judgment could end her career as quickly as it would end Ryan's. As Flight 447 pushed back from the gate and began its taxi to the departure runway, the aircraft carried more than just passengers and crew to Chicago. It carried the accumulated weight of assumptions, prejudices, and power dynamics that were about to collide in ways that none of the participants could anticipate. Hayes continued his departure preparations with the efficiency born of thousands of hours in cockpits, but his attention kept drifting to the cabin monitor that showed passenger seating. Seat 2A appeared as occupied a simple green indicator light that represented what Hayes saw as a personal defeat. In his mind, the wrong person was sitting in that seat, and every minute that situation continued was an affront to the natural order he believed should govern commercial aviation. James Rivera finished typing his message and placed the phone back in his pocket. To any observer, he appeared to be settling in for a routine flight to Chicago, perhaps reviewing business documents or preparing for meetings. But the message he had just sent contained only 13 words. Initiate Protocol 7. Flight SB447. Wait for cruise altitude. JR. The recipient of that message sat in a boardroom 200 miles away where an emergency meeting of AeroVenture Holdings Board of Directors was about to begin. The protocol James had just activated would set in motion a chain of events that would forever change how the airline industry handled discrimination and bias. But Hayes had no way of knowing that the passenger he had spent the last hour humiliating was the same person who signed his paychecks. As the aircraft reached the runway threshold and Hayes received clearance for takeoff, he made one final announcement to the cabin flight attendants: please be seated for departure. And remember, if any passenger causes disruption during flight, we have multiple options for handling the situation once we reach Chicago. The threat was thinly veiled and entirely inappropriate. But in 14 minutes, when Flight 447 reached cruising altitude, Captain William Hayes would discover that some passengers had their own options for handling disruptions. And those options included the power to ground aircraft, terminate careers, and transform an industry. The engine spooled up. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, and Flight 447 lifted off into the Florida evening sky, carrying with it the most expensive lesson in respect that commercial aviation had ever seen. As Flight 447 climbed through 10,000 feet, the aircraft settled into the smooth rhythm of commercial aviation. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated. Passengers shifted in their seats with the familiar discomfort of ascent, and Captain Hayes's voice crackled through the intercom with routine altitude and weather updates. To any observer, it appeared to be a perfectly normal evening flight from Orlando to Chicago. But 200 miles away in a glass-walled boardroom on the 47th floor of a downtown Miami skyscraper, the message James Rivera had sent during taxi was triggering the most significant corporate response in AeroVenture Holdings' history. Protocol 7 has been activated, announced Sarah Chen, AeroVenture's chief operating officer, as she read the encrypted message that had just appeared on her secure tablet. The 6 other board members, seated around the polished mahogany table, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Protocol 7 was a contingency plan that James Rivera had developed 18 months earlier following a series of discrimination incidents across the airline industry. It was designed to provide immediate decisive response when AeroVenture employees engaged in discriminatory behavior that could not be addressed through normal corporate channels. The protocol had never been activated before tonight. Flight SB447 Orlando to Chicago. Chen continued pulling up the flight details on the room's main display screen. Departure time, 8:47 p.m. Estimated arrival, 11:23 p.m. Central. Current altitude, 12,000 feet and climbing. Michael Torres, AeroVenture's chief legal counsel, was already opening his laptop and connecting to the secure network that would allow him to access real-time flight data, crew information, and passenger manifests. "What's the nature of the incident?" Chen read directly from James's message. "Captain-directed discrimination. Public humiliation. Multiple witnesses. Video evidence likely. Employee appears to be unaware of passenger identity. The implications hit the room like a physical force. Every person around that table understood that James Rivera didn't activate Protocol 7 lightly. If he had chosen to trigger the emergency response arrangement, it meant they were dealing with discrimination so blatant and public that normal disciplinary measures would be insufficient. Jesus whispered, Amanda Foster, AeroVenture's chief financial officer. He's experiencing this firsthand again. The board members were among the few people who knew James's personal history with airline discrimination. They understood that his decision to investigate incidents undercover wasn't just corporate due diligence. It was deeply personal. James had built a multi-billion-dollar empire, partly because of the humiliation he had experienced as a young man trying to fly while black, and any employee who inflicted similar treatment on other passengers was attacking the very values AeroVenture had been built to protect. Torres was already accessing Captain Hayes's personnel file, his expression growing darker with each page he reviewed. William Hayes, 48 years old, hired 2006, promoted to captain, 2009. Multiple HR complaints over the years, inappropriate comments to female flight attendants, passenger complaints about unprofessional behavior, interference with ground operations. How has he remained employed? Demanded Dr. Patricia Williams, AeroVenture's Chief Human Resources Officer. Torres continued scrolling through the digital file, protected by union contract supervised by Director of Flight Operations Greg Morrison. Morrison has repeatedly classified complaints as personality conflicts or communication style differences. No formal disciplinary action has ever been taken. Chen was simultaneously pulling up social media monitoring data, and what she found confirmed their worst fears. It's already viral. Multiple passengers recorded the gate confrontation. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Videos are spreading with hashtags Flight 447 and Skybound Discrimination. Current reach is approximately 50,000 views and climbing. The viral spread was exactly what James had anticipated when he activated Protocol 7. Modern discrimination doesn't happen in shadows. It happens in full view of smartphone cameras and social media platforms. By the time Flight 447 landed in Chicago, millions of people would have witnessed Captain Hayes's behavior, and AeroVenture's response would be scrutinized by every civil rights organization, aviation industry analyst, and public relations expert in the country. Initiate full legal response. James's message had continued. Document everything. Prepare termination paperwork for Hayes and any supervisory staff who enabled this pattern. Contact our crisis management team. I want a complete investigation of how this employee was allowed to continue this behavior with corporate protection. Dr. Williams was already accessing Hayes's complete employment history, including performance reviews, training records, and the buried complaints that Morrison had dismissed. What she found painted a picture of an airline employee who had been protected despite clear evidence of bias and misconduct. There's a pattern here going back years, she reported to the board. Female flight attendants reporting inappropriate comments, minority passengers complaining about treatment, gate agents documenting interference with their operations. Morrison has been actively suppressing these complaints. Torres nodded grimly. That makes Morrison complicit. If we can demonstrate that supervisory staff knew about discriminatory behavior and chose not to address it, we're looking at potential institutional liability. The legal implications were staggering. Not only was AeroVenture facing a public relations crisis that could damage the brand for years, but they were also potentially liable for every previous incident involving Hayes that Morrison had covered up. The financial exposure could reach tens of millions of dollars in settlements, regulatory fines, and lost business. But the board members around that table weren't just thinking about financial exposure. They were thinking about the man who had built their company from nothing, who had entrusted them with an empire worth billions, and who was currently sitting in seat 2A, experiencing the kind of treatment that had shaped his entire worldview. "What's James's status right now?" asked Foster. Chen checked the flight tracking data. Flight 447 is at 28,000 feet, approximately 45 minutes into a 2-hour flight. Based on the protocol timeline, he's waiting until cruise altitude to reveal his identity. The timing was strategic. At cruise altitude, the aircraft would be too far from any airport to divert without significant cost and logistical complexity. Captain Hayes would be trapped in a confined space with the person he had spent the evening humiliating, unable to escape the consequences of his actions. The revelation would happen in front of every passenger who had witnessed the discrimination, creating a closed environment where justice could be delivered immediately and publicly. Begin implementation of response protocols. Torres announced, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard. I want Hayes's termination paperwork prepared and ready for electronic signature. I want Morrison's employment contract reviewed for immediate suspension. I want our crisis management team activated for a full media response. Chen was coordinating with the company's IT department to ensure that all relevant video evidence was being preserved and archived. Social media posts, passenger recordings, security camera footage from Orlando International Airport. Everything was being collected and stored for potential legal proceedings. Meanwhile, Dr. Williams was preparing the most important element of AeroVenture's response, a comprehensive review of every employee who had been protected by Morrison's intervention. If Hayes represented a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been institutionally enabled, then every similar case needed to be identified and addressed. How many other employees are we looking at? Foster asked. Williams pulled up the data analysis she had been running. Morrison has supervised 47 pilots over his 8-year tenure as Director of Flight Operations. Based on complaint patterns and disciplinary records, approximately 12 of them show similar flags to Hayes: multiple complaints, pattern of inappropriate behavior, lack of formal discipline. The scope of the problem was becoming clear. Hayes wasn't an isolated bad actor. He was part of a protected class of employees whose behavior had been enabled by supervisory staff who shared their biases. Addressing the problem would require more than just firing one pilot. It would require a complete overhaul of AeroVenture's corporate culture and accountability measures. James anticipated this. Chen observed, reviewing additional notes that had accompanied the Protocol 7 activation. He's requested a full audit of discrimination complaint handling across all AeroVenture properties. He wants to know how many other employees have been protected by supervisors who prioritize loyalty over accountability. The message was clear: this wouldn't be just about Captain Hayes. This would be about transforming an industry that had allowed discrimination to flourish under the protection of corporate hierarchies and union contracts. James Rivera wasn't just going to fire one pilot. He was going to use this moment to send a message that would reverberate throughout commercial aviation. As the board members worked through the night preparing legal documents, coordinating media responses, and implementing accountability measures, Flight 447 continued its journey toward Chicago. In Seat 2A, James Rivera reviewed quarterly financial reports as if nothing unusual had happened. In the cockpit, Captain Hayes flew his aircraft with the confidence of someone who believed his actions would have no consequences. But consequences were already cascading through the corporate infrastructure that surrounded commercial aviation. By the time Flight 447 touched down in Chicago, Captain William Hayes would discover that discrimination delivered in the age of social media carries a price that extends far beyond one ruined flight. The transformation of an industry was beginning at 35,000 feet, guided by a man who had learned long ago that true power isn't about the authority to humiliate others. It's about the ability to ensure that such humiliation never happens again. Flight 447 had been at cruising altitude for 22 minutes when Captain Hayes made the decision that would define the rest of his life. The aircraft was flying smoothly through clear skies at 37,000 feet, the autopilot handling navigation while Hayes stewed in his anger over the evening's events. From his position in the cockpit, he could see through the partially open door to the first-class cabin where James Rivera sat, quietly working on his tablet. The sight of his perceived adversary enjoying premium service while Hayes himself was confined to the cockpit fueled a rage that had been building since the gate confrontation. In Hayes's mind, this wasn't just about one passenger. It was about the erosion of respect for authority, the decline of standards, and the invasion of spaces that should remain exclusive. Ryan Hayes said to his first officer, "I'm going to make an announcement." First Officer Blake looked up from his navigation charts with concern. "Sir, is there a problem with the flight?" Hayes was already reaching for the public address microphone. "There's a problem with passenger behavior that needs to be addressed before we reach Chicago." Ryan felt his stomach drop. Throughout their 6 months of flying together, he had never seen Hayes make a passenger-related announcement during cruise flight. Such announcements were typically reserved for weather updates, arrival information, or genuine safety concerns. Hayes keyed the microphone, and his voice filled the cabin with the authority that 2 decades of flying had given him. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 37,000 feet en route to Chicago O'Hare, where we expect an on-time arrival despite some delays during our departure process. In seat 2A, James Rivera looked up from his tablet for the first time since takeoff. Something in the captain's tone suggested this wasn't a routine update. Hayes continued, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin speakers. I want to take a moment to address a situation that occurred during boarding tonight. We had a passenger who became aggressive with crew members and challenged aircraft security protocols. While this individual is currently on board, I want to assure all passengers that appropriate documentation has been filed, and this person will be met by law enforcement upon our arrival in Chicago. The cabin went dead silent. Every passenger understood exactly who Hayes was talking about, and the injustice of the announcement hit them like a physical blow. In the first-class cabin, several passengers turned to look at James Rivera with expressions of sympathy and outrage. Jennifer Walsh, still recording sporadically from her seat in 4C, captured the moment when Hayes's words registered with their target. James Rivera's expression didn't change. No anger, no fear, no embarrassment. Instead, there was something almost like relief, as if Hayes had just confirmed something that James had been waiting to hear. James calmly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. But instead of the standard smartphone most passengers carried, this device had a distinctive titanium case with security features that marked it as something far more sophisticated than consumer electronics. Marcus Thompson, live streaming from the main cabin, had managed to position his phone to capture both the first-class area and the general passenger reaction to Hayes's announcement. His viewer count had climbed past 8,000 people, and the chat was exploding with outrage over what they were witnessing. Hayes wasn't finished. Emboldened by what he interpreted as passenger support for his position, he continued his announcement. I want all passengers to understand that federal aviation regulations require compliance with crew member instructions. Passengers who refuse to comply or who display threatening behavior toward crew members face serious federal charges and permanent banning from air travel. The threat was unmistakable and entirely inappropriate. Hayes was using his position as captain to publicly threaten a passenger who had committed no crime other than existing in a space Hayes didn't think he belonged. But if Hayes expected his target to cower or protest, he was about to be disappointed in ways he couldn't imagine. James Rivera stood up. The movement was calm and deliberate, without any of the agitation or anger that Hayes had been trying to provoke. James simply rose from his seat, stepped into the aisle, and began walking toward the cockpit with the measured pace of someone who owned the ground beneath his feet. Patricia Coleman, the lead flight attendant, intercepted him near the galley. Sir, please return to your seat. The captain has requested that all passengers remain seated. James looked at her with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the evening. Ms. Coleman, I need to speak with Captain Hayes immediately. Patricia had been flying for 15 years, and she recognized the tone of someone who was accustomed to having their requests fulfilled without question. But her training and company policy were clear. Passengers did not approach the cockpit during flight except in genuine emergencies. Sir, if you have a concern, I can relay it to the cockpit, but I can't allow passengers to... James reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather credential case. He opened it carefully, revealing identification that made Patricia's eyes widen in shock. Ms. Coleman James said quietly, I'm James Rivera, chairman and majority owner of AeroVenture Holdings. I need to speak with Captain Hayes immediately about his conduct toward passengers on my airline. The words hit Patricia like a lightning strike. She stared at the identification, then at the man holding it, then back at the identification. The credential case contained not just standard corporate ID, but also FAA authorization for executive oversight of airline operations. Behind her, several first-class passengers had overheard the exchange. The revelation rippled through the cabin like a shockwave as passengers realized they had been witnessing something unprecedented, an airline employee discriminating against his own boss. Jennifer Walsh nearly dropped her phone as the implications hit her. The man who had been publicly humiliated and threatened was the owner of the airline. Every passenger who had witnessed the gate confrontation understood that they had just seen an employee destroy his own career in real time. Hayes, unaware of the revelation taking place in his cabin, was feeling victorious in the cockpit. His announcement had been delivered without challenge, and he interpreted the cabin's silence as validation of his authority. He turned to Ryan with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he had won a significant battle. "That's how you handle troublemakers," Blake Hayes said. "Show strength early, and they'll back down every time." Ryan was staring through the cockpit door at the scene unfolding in the first-class cabin. He could see the lead flight attendant in intense conversation with the passenger from 2A, and something about their body language suggested this wasn't a typical crew-passenger interaction. Captain Ryan said carefully, "I think you should look at what's happening in the cabin." Hayes glanced through the cockpit door just in time to see Patricia Coleman stepping aside as James Rivera approached the cockpit threshold. For a moment, Hayes's brain couldn't process what he was seeing. The passenger he had spent the evening humiliating was standing at his cockpit door, with the lead flight attendant's obvious deference and respect. "Captain Hayes James," said his voice carrying the quiet authority that had built a billion-dollar empire. "I'm James Rivera, Chairman and CEO of Aero Venture Holdings. I believe we need to have a conversation about your conduct tonight." The words hit Hayes like a physical blow. His face went from confident smugness to ashen shock in the span of 3 seconds. Behind James, the entire first-class cabin had turned to watch the confrontation, and several passengers were recording what they understood to be a historic moment in aviation justice. That's impossible." Hayes stammered, his voice barely audible. You were wearing I was wearing clothes that apparently led you to make assumptions about who I am and what I deserve," James replied calmly. "In the past 2 hours, you have publicly humiliated me, made false accusations about my behavior, threatened me with arrest, and used your position as captain to continue harassing me during flight." Ryan Blake sat frozen in his pilot seat watching his captain's career disintegrate in real time. Everything he had witnessed since the gate confrontation was suddenly recontextualized. Hayes hadn't been dealing with a difficult passenger. He had been attacking the person who owned the airline. Hayes tried to speak, but no words came. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as the magnitude of his error became clear. Every word he had spoken, every assumption he had made, every act of discrimination he had committed had been directed at the person who had the power to end not just his career, but his ability to work in aviation ever again. "Captain Hayes," James continued, his voice never rising but carrying absolute authority. "You are relieved of duty, effective immediately." The words echoed through the cockpit and into the cabin beyond, where passengers erupted in spontaneous applause. Justice delayed for 2 hours was finally being delivered at 37,000 feet. Hayes found his voice, but it came out as a desperate whisper. "You can't. I have a union contract." "There are procedures." James stepped fully into the cockpit, his presence filling the small space with an authority that made Hayes shrink back in his captain's seat. "Your union contract doesn't protect discrimination, Captain, and your procedures don't override federal anti-discrimination laws." Ryan Blake realized that he was witnessing the most significant moment in his young aviation career. The passenger his captain had spent the evening abusing was revealing himself to be the most powerful person in the airline industry that Ryan hoped to build his future in. First Officer Blake James said, turning his attention to the young pilot, "Are you qualified to serve as pilot in command for the remainder of this flight?" Ryan's training kicked in despite his shock. "Yes, sir. I'm fully qualified and current on the 737. "Then you are now the captain of this flight," James announced. "Captain Hayes is to be removed from the cockpit immediately." Hayes made one last, desperate attempt to maintain his authority. "You can't do this. I'm the pilot in command. Federal aviation regulations don't allow passengers to." James interrupted him with the voice of someone who had been making life-changing decisions for 2 decades. "Captain Hayes, I'm not just a passenger. I'm the person who owns this aircraft, employs this crew, and signs your paycheck. And you've just demonstrated that you're unfit to represent this airline or serve these passengers." The truth hit Hayes like a falling anvil. Every act of discrimination, every moment of arrogance, every word of hatred he had directed at James Rivera had been aimed at the person who controlled his livelihood. He had committed career suicide in the most public way possible, and there would be no appeals, no second chances, no union protection from the consequences of his actions. Patricia Coleman appeared at the cockpit door with 2 other flight attendants. "Sir," she said to James, "how would you like us to handle the crew change?" James looked back at Hayes, who sat slumped in his captain's seat like a deflated balloon. "Captain Hayes will be escorted to a passenger seat for the remainder of the flight. He is no longer authorized to perform any crew duties on this aircraft." As Hayes was led from the cockpit he had commanded for over a decade, he passed the passengers who had witnessed his downfall. There was no sympathy in their expressions, only the satisfaction of seeing justice delivered to someone who had abused his power. James Rivera returned to seat 2A, but the cabin atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Every passenger understood they had witnessed something unprecedented, the complete reversal of power between someone who had wielded authority carelessly and someone who had earned it through dignity and restraint. The man who had been targeted for discrimination had revealed himself to be the ultimate authority in the situation, and Captain William Hayes had just learned the most expensive lesson of his career in the modern world: you never know who you're really talking to. The transformation of Flight 447 from a routine evening departure to the epicenter of aviation industry justice happened in real time, documented by multiple passenger phones and broadcast live to thousands of viewers across social media platforms. As former Captain Hayes was escorted to seat 31B in the main cabin, his removal was captured from multiple angles and streamed instantly to an audience that was growing by the minute. Marcus Thompson's live stream had exploded to over 15,000 concurrent viewers, with the comment section moving so fast it was impossible to read individual messages. Hashtags Flight 447, Justice and Power Reveal were trending nationally as people shared videos and expressed amazement at what they had just witnessed. In the cockpit, newly appointed Captain Ryan Blake was experiencing the most intense 15 minutes of his aviation career. At 31 years old, he had just been promoted from first officer to pilot in command by the owner of the airline in the middle of a flight after witnessing his former captain's spectacular self-destruction. "Chicago approach," Ryan transmitted into his headset, his voice steadier than he felt. "This is Skybound 447 requesting priority handling for crew change situation." The air traffic controller's response came back immediately. "Skybound 447, we're showing you have a pilot in command change. Confirm your status." Ryan looked back toward the cabin where James Rivera was calmly returning to his seat amid the continued buzz of passenger conversation and phone cameras. "Chicago approach. We have a qualified pilot in command change. Flight operations, normal requesting, normal approach and landing." What Ryan couldn't see was the controlled chaos unfolding in air traffic control centers across the Midwest as word of Flight 447's situation spread through aviation communication networks. Controllers were being briefed that the flight was carrying the owner of AeroVenture Holdings, that a discrimination incident had resulted in the captain being removed from duty, and that the entire situation was being broadcast live across social media. In the cabin, James Rivera had returned to seat 2A, but the dynamic of the aircraft had fundamentally changed. Patricia Coleman approached him with obvious deference, her entire demeanor reflecting the revelation of his identity. "Mr. Rivera," she said quietly, "is there anything you need? And what would you like us to do about the media situation?" James glanced around the cabin, noting the phones still recording and the passengers still buzzing with excitement over what they had witnessed. "Ms. Coleman, these passengers are witnesses to something important. Let them document it. But I'd appreciate it if you could make an announcement explaining that what happened here tonight represents the values we expect from every AeroVenture employee." Patricia nodded and reached for the cabin announcement microphone. Her voice, when it came through the speakers, carried a warmth and pride that hadn't been there during Hayes' announcements. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Patricia Coleman, your lead flight attendant. I want to address what you've just witnessed and assure you that tonight's events represent exactly the kind of accountability and leadership that AeroVenture Holdings is committed to providing." She paused, glancing toward James Rivera, who nodded encouragingly. "The passenger in seat 2A is Mr. James Rivera, chairman and CEO of AeroVenture Holdings, the parent company of Skybound Airlines. Mr. Rivera was traveling incognito tonight when he experienced discrimination from our former captain. What you witnessed was not just justice for one individual, but a demonstration that no employee, at any level, is exempt from treating every passenger with dignity and respect." The cabin erupted in applause that lasted for nearly a minute. Passengers throughout the aircraft were clapping not just for the justice they had witnessed, but for the leadership that had delivered it. Several people shouted, "Thank you," toward the first-class cabin, and more than one passenger wiped away tears. But while passengers celebrated, the consequences of the evening's events were cascading through corporate offices and regulatory agencies across the country. James Rivera's activation of Protocol 7 had set in motion a response that would reshape how the airline industry handled discrimination complaints. In Miami, the AeroVenture Holdings Board of Directors had spent the past 2 hours implementing the most comprehensive corporate response in the company's history. Legal teams were preparing not just termination paperwork for Hayes, but also suspension notices for Director of Flight Operations Greg Morrison and any other supervisory staff who had enabled discriminatory behavior. Dr. Patricia Williams, AeroVenture's Chief Human Resources Officer, was leading a real-time audit of every discrimination complaint filed against AeroVenture employees over the past 5 years. What she was discovering painted a disturbing picture of institutional protection for employees who shared Hayes' attitudes. "We have 17 separate incidents involving Captain Hayes," she reported to the board via secure video conference. Morrison classified every single complaint as miscommunication or personality conflict. In 3 cases, the complainants were removed from their positions or transferred to other bases. The legal implications were staggering. If AeroVenture's own investigation revealed a pattern of protected discrimination, the company faced not just public relations damage, but potential federal civil rights violations and millions of dollars in settlement costs. Meanwhile, social media was transforming Flight 447 from a single incident into a national conversation about discrimination in the travel industry. Jennifer Walsh's original video from the gate had been shared over 50,000 times, with comments ranging from personal stories of similar treatment to demands for industry-wide reform. The hashtag Flight447 was now trending in the top 3 nationally, competing with major political and entertainment news for social media attention. Aviation industry analysts were already writing articles about the incident's implications for airline employee training and corporate accountability. But the most significant consequence was unfolding in the main cabin of Flight 447 itself, where former Captain Hayes sat in seat 31B, experiencing the complete collapse of his professional identity. The man who had walked onto the aircraft as a senior captain with 18 years of experience was now just another passenger stripped of authority and facing an uncertain future. Hayes stared out the small window at the lights of cities passing below, trying to process the magnitude of his error. Every assumption he had made, every word he had spoken, every act of discrimination he had committed had been directed at the person who owned the airline. His union contract wouldn't protect him from this. His years of experience meant nothing now. He had destroyed his own career through his inability to see past skin color to human dignity. Passengers in the seats around Hayes maintained careful distance, both physical and social. Word had spread through the cabin about what had happened, and nobody wanted to be associated with the man who had become a symbol of workplace discrimination. Hayes found himself completely isolated, surrounded by people, but utterly alone with the consequences of his actions. As Flight 447 began its descent into Chicago, James Rivera finally put away his tablet and reflected on the evening's events. What had started as an undercover investigation into discrimination complaints had become a defining moment not just for his airline, but for an entire industry. The video evidence being shared across social media would force every airline to examine its own policies and training programs. But for James, the most important outcome wasn't corporate policy or media coverage. It was the message being sent to every employee that discrimination would not be tolerated, protected, or overlooked at any level of the organization. Hayes's removal wasn't just about punishing one individual. It was about establishing a standard that would protect future passengers from similar treatment. Patricia Coleman made one final announcement as the aircraft prepared for landing. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be arriving at Chicago O'Hare in approximately 12 minutes. On behalf of Aero Venture Holdings and Skybound Airlines, I want to thank you for your patience tonight and assure you that what you witnessed represents our commitment to treating every passenger with the respect they deserve." She paused, her voice carrying obvious emotion as she continued. "The events of this flight will be remembered as a turning point in how our industry handles discrimination. You were witnesses to justice, and your documentation of these events will help ensure that no passenger faces the treatment you saw directed at Mr. Rivera tonight." As the aircraft touched down at O'Hare, passengers spontaneously applauded again, not just for the landing, but for the justice they had witnessed at 37,000 feet. Airport security and media were already waiting at the gate, alerted by the social media coverage and corporate notifications that had preceded the flight's arrival. Hayes would be escorted from the aircraft and driven home by airport security, his airline career officially over before he reached the terminal. Ryan Blake would be met by Aero Venture executives eager to discuss his promotion and his role in handling the evening's crisis. And James Rivera would disembark as the same person he had always been. But his airline and the industry it represented had been fundamentally changed by 3 hours of documented discrimination and immediate accountability. The most expensive lesson in respect that commercial aviation had ever seen was complete, but its effects would resonate through the industry for years to come. 3 months after Flight 447 became the most documented case of airline discrimination in aviation history, James Rivera stood in the same gate area at Orlando International Airport, where his journey had begun. But tonight, he wasn't traveling incognito in a hoodie and jeans. He was wearing a tailored business suit, accompanied by a film crew documenting the launch of Aero Venture's new Passenger Dignity Initiative. The gate area looked identical to that evening in March, but everything else had changed. Sophia Martinez, the gate agent who had tried to help during the original incident, was now Aero Venture's Director of Customer Experience, having been promoted based on her courage in standing up for what was right despite personal risk to her career, Mr. Rivera, Sophia said, approaching him with the confidence that came from being recognized for her integrity. Flight 447 to Chicago is ready for boarding. Same route, same aircraft type, but I think you'll find the experience quite different. James smiled, remembering the young woman who had wanted to help, but been silenced by a captain's intimidation. Thank you, Sophia. And congratulations again on your new position. Customer experience needs leaders who understand that dignity isn't negotiable. The boarding process began with an announcement that would have been impossible 3 months earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Skybound Airlines Flight 447 to Chicago. Tonight's flight is being operated under our new Flight 447 protocol, which ensures that every passenger receives the respect and service they deserve, regardless of appearance, background, or seat assignment. The protocol had become AeroVenture's signature innovation, copied by airlines across the industry. It mandated specific training for all crew members, established clear consequences for discriminatory behavior, and created anonymous reporting networks that couldn't be buried by supervisory staff. Most importantly, it was named after the flight where change had begun. Captain Ryan Blake emerged from the jet bridge wearing the 4 gold stripes that had once belonged to William Hayes. At 31, Ryan was now one of AeroVenture's youngest senior captains, promoted not just for his technical skills, but for his moral courage in supporting justice when it mattered most. Mr. Rivera, Ryan said, approaching with the professional respect that characterized the new generation of AeroVenture leadership, "It's an honor to have you aboard tonight. We're proud to operate under the standards you established on this route." James shook Ryan's hand, remembering the uncertain young first officer who had been caught between loyalty and conscience. "Captain Blake, you earned those stripes by choosing what was right over what was easy. That's the kind of leadership this industry needs." As passengers boarded Flight 447, they passed a small plaque that had been installed at the aircraft entrance. This aircraft operates under the Flight 447 protocol. Every passenger deserves dignity, respect, and equal treatment regardless of appearance or background. Discrimination stops here. The plaque was the idea of Patricia Coleman, the former lead flight attendant, who was now AeroVenture's director of in-flight services. Patricia had become the public face of the company's cultural transformation, speaking at aviation conferences and training programs about the night she watched a passenger reveal himself as the owner of the airline. Among tonight's passengers was Dr. Maya Johnson, a 34-year-old pediatrician traveling to Chicago for a medical conference. Dr. Johnson was African American, and she had booked the flight specifically because she had seen the Flight 447 videos and wanted to support an airline that had demonstrated real commitment to equality. "Excuse me," Dr. Johnson said to Sophia during boarding. "I just wanted to say thank you. My daughter is 8 years old, and when she grows up, she'll be able to travel on airlines that respect her because of what happened on this route." Sophia felt tears welling in her eyes. The personal stories had been the most powerful part of the past 3 months. Passengers reaching out to share how the Flight 447 incident had given them hope that change was possible, that dignity could be defended, and that corporate leadership could choose justice over convenience. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, James reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The investigation that had started with discrimination complaints had revealed institutional problems that went far beyond one bigoted captain. Greg Morrison, the director of flight operations who had protected Hayes and others like him, had been terminated along with 6 other supervisory staff members who had enabled discriminatory behavior. But the most significant change hadn't been the firings. It had been the cultural transformation that followed. AeroVenture had implemented the most comprehensive anti-discrimination training program in the airline industry, created employee resource groups that gave voice to previously marginalized staff, and established accountability measures that made it impossible for bias to hide behind corporate hierarchy. The economic impact had been remarkable. Despite initial fears that the negative publicity would hurt business, AeroVenture's passenger numbers had increased by 23% over the past quarter. Travelers were actively choosing the airline because they trusted it to treat them with respect. Employee satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs as workers felt proud of their company's values. Other airlines had been forced to implement similar programs as passengers demanded the same standards of dignity that AeroVenture had established. The Flight 447 protocol was being studied in business schools as an example of how moral leadership could create competitive advantage. But for James, the most meaningful outcome was personal. 2 weeks ago, he had received a handwritten letter from a 16-year-old black student named Marcus Williams, who lived in the same Miami neighborhood where James had grown up. Marcus wrote that he was planning to study aviation in college because he had seen that airlines could be led by people who looked like him and who cared about treating everyone fairly, Mr. Rivera. Marcus had written, "My mom showed me the videos from your flight, and it made me cry because I knew that could have been me or my dad getting treated that way. But then I saw how you handled it, and it made me proud. I want to work for a company like yours someday." James had called Marcus personally and arranged for him to visit Aero Ventures headquarters for a day of job shadowing. During their conversation, Marcus had asked the question that meant the most. "Why didn't you just get angry and yell at that captain?" "Because anger burns out quickly," James had replied. "But dignity and justice last forever. When you treat people with respect, even people who don't respect you, you're building something that can't be torn down by anyone else's ignorance." As Flight 447 reached cruising altitude, Captain Blake made an announcement that would have been impossible during Hayes's era. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Tonight marks the 3-month anniversary of the flight that changed our industry. We're proud to operate an airline where every passenger is valued, every employee is held accountable, and discrimination has no place at any altitude. The passengers applauded, understanding that they were part of something larger than transportation. They were part of a movement toward equality and respect that had begun in the same seats they now occupied." James Rivera looked out the window at the lights of cities passing below, thinking about the journey that had brought him from a discriminated against teenager to the owner of an airline that was changing an entire industry. The humiliation he had experienced as a young man had been transformed into fuel for justice, and the discrimination he had faced on Flight 447 had become the catalyst for protecting millions of future passengers. But the most powerful change wasn't in corporate policies or training programs. It was in the simple recognition that every person deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of what they wore, or how much money they had, or what color their skin was. That truth defended at 37,000 feet by a man who refused to let hatred define his response had transformed not just one airline, but an entire industry's understanding of what service really meant. The lesson of Flight 447 wasn't about the power to fire employees or change policies. It was about the power of maintaining dignity in the face of discrimination, choosing justice over revenge, and using privilege to protect others rather than just yourself. James Rivera had learned that lesson as a young man sleeping in his car after being denied a hotel room. He had applied it as a billionaire choosing to experience discrimination firsthand rather than addressing it from a boardroom. And he had demonstrated it on a flight where the choice between anger and grace had determined whether one incident would end with personal satisfaction or begin an industry transformation. As Flight 447 began its descent into Chicago, passengers throughout the cabin understood they had been part of something historic, not just the 3-month anniversary of a viral incident, but the ongoing proof that change was possible when leaders chose courage over comfort and justice over convenience. And in seat 2A, James Rivera smiled quietly, knowing that tomorrow there would be thousands of flights operated by crew members who understood that their most important job wasn't flying aircraft. It was treating every passenger like they mattered, regardless of anything else. That was the true legacy of Flight 447. The recognition that dignity wasn't a privilege to be earned, but a right to be protected. And that lesson learned at 37,000 feet and shared with millions through social media was changing not just how people flew, but how they treated each other on the ground. If this story moved you the way it moved millions of others, I need you to do something important. Hit that like button right now, not just because it helps the channel, but because every like sends a message that stories about justice and dignity matter. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when faced with injustice. And here's the most important part. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who's been discriminated against and needs to know their dignity has value. Share it with someone in a position of power who needs to remember that true authority comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Because when we share stories like this, we're not just spreading entertainment, we're spreading hope. We're proving that change is possible when good people refuse to stay silent. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever witnessed someone standing up for what's right when it would have been easier to stay quiet? I read every comment, and your stories matter. Until next time, remember, dignity isn't negotiable, respect isn't earned by appearance, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply treat another human being like they matter. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.